Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jakob. Dear Engelberg academics, I would first of all like to thank actually Jakob for this invitation to reflect on violence from the perspective of the International Committee of the Red Cross. In preparing for this conference, I realized that this invitation has come at a quite appropriate moment for me as a person. As Jakob has said, I was born and raised in a peaceful place near Schaffhausen, where I wanted to spend my professional life as a lawyer. And then I joined in '84 ICRC, actually just for 2 years, I thought, before opening my law office. But my first field missions to the Palestinian occupied territories, to South Africa, and to Iraq were so intense that my connection to the orderly life of Schaffhausen broke down. And I became completely and enthusiastically involved with the ICRC, an organization, as you know, which concentrates on preserving a minimum of humanity in the midst of war. And now, a quarter of a century later, as I prepare to hand over my responsibilities as a Director General to my successor, indeed, I think the time has come for me to start reflecting on this key period of my life. So, allow me to start my presentation with some 5 observations that have stayed with me. Looking back, it strikes me, first of all, that during the full quarter of a century that I spent with the ICRC, not a single day went by when fighting was not going on somewhere in the world. In fact, at any given moment during this period, there were some 20 or more armed conflicts underway. Moreover, I realize that 2 out of the first 3 conflicts I was involved with as a young ICRC delegate 25 years ago are still open and burning wounds as we speak. After 6 military confrontations in 1948, 56, 67, 73, 78, and 82, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as the Arab world at large, has flared up again another 4 times since I finished my field assignment there. In '87 with the first Palestinian uprising, in 2000 with the second Intifada, in 2006 with the summer war in Lebanon, and earlier this year, again with the Israeli campaign in Gaza. And this is, although a political solution to this deep-rooted conflict has been in sight since 1948. But still today, war is far more familiar to millions of Israelis and Palestinians than peace. Iraq, where I spent my 3rd assignment, meanwhile, has gone from bad to worse. In 1987-88, I spent the last year of the war between Iran and Iraq in Baghdad, trying to bring some comfort and news from home to Iranian prisoners of war. When that war came to an end in summer of 1988, a sigh of relief went through both countries, which had both lost hundreds of thousands of able young men or even children at some time during 8 years of outright warfare. Yet only 2 years later, Iraqi troops occupied Kuwait on August 2, 1990. So, having had the privilege of accompanying home tens of thousands of prisoners released by Iran and Iraq, we were once again visiting almost 100,000 new prisoners of war in early '91. And some were indeed the same. Since then, the more than 20 million Iraqis have suffered the combined effects of a ruthless repressive regime, a harsh economic embargo, belligerent occupation, and disastrous periods of civil war. Generations of Iraqis have been profoundly marked by violence and suffering. So, first observation is that engaging in war has remained a valid option for states and interest groups involved in political, ideological, economic, or ethnic disputes. The second observation is that wars are here to last. Violence breeds violence. Once the use of armed force has broken down peaceful ways of addressing conflicts in a given context, there is an enormous risk that violence will become endemic and long-lasting, and that subsequent generations of the nations involved will be affected. Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Colombia provide further tragic evidence of this. South Africa. My second field assignment, however, is proof that political vision and resolve can make the difference in this respect. In the mid-1980s, I spent more than a year in this country developing Red Cross first aid and emergency teams in the townships. These were boiling at the time with tension and torn apart by sectarian fighting, fomented and manipulated by the apartheid regime. At the end of my mission, I was convinced that this country would inevitably end in civil war. In fact, it has not up to now. And this is, in my view, entirely due to the political wisdom and determination of leaders like Nelson Mandela, whom I had the privilege of visiting while he was still a political prisoner in Pollsmoor prison. During 2 hours of private talks in his prison cell, he told me about the strategies necessary to overcome sectarian violence and to lay the groundwork for a multiracial South Africa. At the time, I was impressed, but skeptical whether such a far-reaching and generous political program could succeed in a society so deeply affected by violence. Observing the course of events in South Africa over the late 80s and the early 90s, I realized that Nelson Mandela and a group of other far-sighted leaders in the different communities did actually put into practice the concept I had heard about in his prison cell in 1986, averting the looming risk of civil war. So my third observation is that armed conflict, the violence and the suffering that comes with it, can indeed be prevented and stopped through ambitious and resolute political will. Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Timor-Leste are among the other examples that support this observation. My fourth observation relates to a memory dating back to the summer of 1993. Driving from Sarajevo to Kiseljak in central Bosnia during a lull in the fighting, I became a direct witness of ethnic cleansing in action. We saw a modest farmhouse in flames and the family silently packing a few belongings onto a cart attached to their tractor. With closed, fearful faces, they loaded the three-generation family onto the vehicle and drove off, ignoring us and any possible assistance. At the same time, their neighbors were standing by casually and relaxed in the late afternoon sun of this warm summer day. Some leaning on the fence, simply watching the farmhouse burn down. After living for decades as neighboring farmers, they had suddenly started to threaten them, demanding that they leave their property and the valley. And on the day of the departure, they burned down their house to seal this expulsion. Not a single cry or insult, not a tear. An incredibly mechanical process of neighbors turning violent almost surreal in its banality. As I became more involved in the Balkans, I started to realize that such events were in fact deeply rooted in the collective memory of the people. Trying to fulfill our mandate to protect, we often made representations concerning abuses of prisoners or civilians to the authorities of the different fighting factions. Quite often, the reaction of our interlocutors was not so much to deny the alleged facts, but to justify whatever had happened by telling us about cases of horrific abuse, torture, and killings that had been perpetrated against their forefathers during the Second World War. These events were recalled with such intensity and often such a hatred. It was as if our present-day interlocutor had been directly involved as a victim or eyewitness. The fact that these events dated back 2 generations was completely irrelevant to them. Thus, it was as if the horrific acts committed during the Civil War, which had raged in Yugoslavia under Nazi occupation, were being seamlessly continued some 50 years later. A few years later, I made a similarly gloomy observation in Algeria. We were involved in a program that offered psychological and social support to young women who had first been sexually abused by combatants and then rejected by their own families, who felt dishonored by having them in their midst. Overwhelmed by such vicious brutality, I started to investigate the origin of this pattern of violence. I was not only to learn that, in fact, girls and young women were singled out and systematically abused during attacks as a means of destroying the social fabric in its most fundamental expression, the cohesion and solidarity of the family, but that, moreover, the very same pattern of violence had been widespread during the Algerian War of the 1950s. At that time, the regular and irregular forces, armed forces, were affiliated to totally different causes. But their methods of bringing destruction and suffering on the enemy have survived in the people's minds over several generations and have been reactivated, unchanged, in a totally different setting of conflict almost half a century later. I retain from this painful experience the following. War is not only an affair of politicians, armies, and rebels who are committed to pursuing their cause by means of force. With a few exceptions, the armed conflicts of our recent history have been wars among people, rather than so-called conventional wars between structured armed forces of sovereign states. In these civil wars, atavistic patterns of violence are activated, which are enshrined in the social subconscious of the particular group in a given cultural setting. There must be a sort of collective DNA of violence that is being transmitted from generation to generation, only to be activated when one particular group is drawn into confrontation with another. Thus, after years of civilized and peaceful coexistence, families and neighborhoods can break apart and engage in destructive violence. Since much of my experience in the field was gained in the former Yugoslavia, which for decades swept the painful memories of past brutalities and violence under a carpet of political slogans and social engineering, I wonder whether approaches such as truth commissions in South Africa and elsewhere, or judicial proceedings such as those applied in Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia now, can actually succeed in disrupting this chain of subconsciously inherent drivers of violence. I sincerely hope they do. But I also keep vividly in mind a remark I heard in Pale the Serb stronghold above Sarajevo, just after the conclusion of the Dayton Accords in 1995, when we were getting ready for the release and repatriation of all prisoners. Don't you worry, I was told. This war is definitely over. We and our children will now live in peace. But keep in mind that over the past 2 centuries, every second generation in this country has been taking up the fight along the same lines. So our grandchildren will continue the war we have just stopped now. This brings me to a 5th observation, which actually constitutes the most traumatic experience of my 25 years with the ICRC. In 1995, the same year, but a couple of months earlier, after several months of short-lived ceasefires and a lot of negotiating at the airport of Sarajevo, in Belgrade and elsewhere, outright fighting had resumed in Bosnia in early May. Amidst nervous speculation that the war was soon to end, fighting became ever more intense, principally around the besieged city of Sarajevo, but also on other front lines, in particular around the Krajina and the so-called UN safe areas, the enclaves of Bihać, Gorazde, Žepa, and Srebrenica. As rumors about the necessity of a swap of territories and the corresponding further forced transfer of populations filtered out of the negotiating quarters in Zagreb, Belgrade, and Sarajevo, Serb troops attacked and moved into the enclaves of Srebrenica and Žepa in mid-July, capturing hundreds of UN peacekeeping troops and forcing the transfer of tens of thousands of women, children, and old men to neighboring Tuzla in central Bosnia. All of this was done in the spotlight of the international media and amid the intense diplomatic activity of all major powers as well as the UN. However, it took several weeks for all of these parties, the ICRC included, to realize the true horror. All able men in Srebrenica, whether they had any part in the fighting or not, were rounded up, taken away, and systematically killed in mass executions. Those who had tried to escape to central Bosnia through the woods were killed in ambushes. Across the front line in Tuzla, our delegates were assisting the women and children as they arrived and collecting the names of all those who were missing. Thus, they put together a list of those massacred in the biggest mass murder in Europe since the Second World War. More than 7,000 men had been systematically exterminated in those few days of July 95. For my colleagues and myself, this came as a devastating blow. All our efforts to keep alive a minimum of humanity in the midst of this terrible civil war were laid to waste. Total war, the cold-blooded extermination of prisoners and civilians, had forced its way into Europe again, and none of us had been able to stop it in time. The world has never been the same for me after handing over in early September 95 the first list of thousands of names to the Bosnian Serb Vice President Koljević, requesting that action be taken to clarify their fate and to bring those responsible for this massacre to justice. 2 months later, my interlocutor signed the accords in Dayton for the Bosnian Serb side, and a year later he committed suicide. But to date, those who carry direct responsibility for this hideous massacre have not been brought to justice yet. I had been following the terrible killings in Vukovar in 91 and was exposed to many other war crimes perpetrated during this conflict. Yet even in my worst dreams, I had not imagined that such a horrific, radical, and systematic massacre could be possibly be committed in the middle of Europe by forces with whom we had been in contact for years. My previous conviction that our humanitarian work would contribute to forestalling such extreme acts of destruction was shaken by profound doubts. And my exuberant humanitarian enthusiasm has given way to a much more skeptical and sober, but no less resolute commitment to the humanitarian cause. Indeed, humanitarianism, as we understand it at the ICRC, is not so much a cause of idealists, but a political philosophy for action to preserve a minimum of human dignity and conditions for survival in the midst of violent conflict between states and non-state armed groups. In a second part of my presentation, I would now like to explore to which extent the approach of limited warfare has been successful in pushing back its rival, the dynamics of total war, and to briefly highlight how the ICRC has contributed in this endeavor. In a recent interview in Zurich, Jan-Philipp Remsma said that we all have a whole range of potential human capacities which are activated differently according to the specific historic and personal context. In the right conditions, and if the use of violence is sufficiently legitimized, he said, a majority of people will always be ready to commit terrible acts. However, he added, at the same time and in the same context, there will be people who will refuse at all costs to participate in such acts. Both patterns of behavior spring from the same human potential. So there is an element of choice for all those involved. There is no firewall between civilized behavior and barbarianism. History provides ample evidence of a persistent practice of limited warfare, which has kept challenging the cruel and sometimes apocalyptic dynamics of total war. This has recently been well documented by Hugo Slim, a scholar who spent many years in the field as a humanitarian worker before delivering an in-depth study on the topic in his somewhat gruesome book entitled Killing Civilians. Genghis Khan and the Crusaders waged a rather limitless total war, while the chivalric practices of the Middle Ages were governed by stricter rules. In the 19th century, scorched earth policies were widely applied, an entire population exterminated in the competitive struggle between colonial empires. Slim documents a terrible tradition of limitless war, which eventually pushed humankind towards the abyss during the Second World War. Degeneration into total war, involving genocide, systematic bombings of cities, and the use of weapons of mass destruction. Nevertheless, most cultures and civilizations have formulated, whether codified or not, rules limiting the means and methods of warfare. Killing a prisoner or a wounded combatant has been frowned upon by most cultures. Over time, many great men have fought to spare civilians not taking part in the hostilities. Hugo Grotius, who tried to codify the notion of limited war into an international law of nations in his De Jure Belli ac Pacis in 1625, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire's Candide all prove that these efforts were very much present during the birth of our modern world. So the stage was set when Henri Dunant, a businessman from Geneva, reignited this debate in the second half of the 19th century and formulated a mission statement and a unique operational approach which still guide the International Committee of the Red Cross today. You have all heard of Henri Dunant, that there is no need for me to introduce this extraordinary Genevan businessman who was so full of genius that he managed to create one of the world's greatest social enterprises while being himself driven out of his hometown and the organization he had created. But let us have a brief look at what Dunant experienced exactly 150 years ago in 1859 in northern Italy. Dunant was trying to reach Napoleon III in a lobbying effort for his business in Algeria, when he witnessed one of the fiercest battles of the second half of the 19th century. The French, the Austrian armies had clashed on a battlefield in Solferino near Lake Garda. Almost 40,000 casualties were left after 15 hours of fierce fighting. Many were dead, most were dying in excruciating pain from their terrible wounds. Henri Dunant was profoundly moved by the human suffering of the dying and wounded he saw, and he decided to interrupt his journey and set out to organize help. He relieved pain, treated wounds where he could, and comforted the dying. He was, of course, not the first person in human history to display compassion and step up to help. Florence Nightingale and the Good Samaritan come immediately to mind. Compassion is also part of human nature. What makes him different is that he went a step further. After returning home, Henri Dunant wrote a book called A Memory of Solferino, which became a bestseller across Europe. He put forward ideas and proposals for the future aimed at preventing a repetition of the carnage and suffering he had witnessed at Solferino. Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military commander and strategist, had already recognized, quite pragmatically, that pure barbarity is an inefficient way of winning a war. If we find civilized nations do not put their prisoners to death, do not devastate towns and countries, he wrote, this is because their intelligence has taught them more effectual means of applying force than these rude acts of mere instinct. Like Clausewitz, Henri Dunant was convinced that yes, there would be more wars in the future, but that they did not need to be limitless, that military necessity could rationally be balanced by considerations of constraint. Most of the suffering at Solferino seemed utterly unnecessary to him. Why did wounded soldiers need to be killed, trampled to death, or left alone to die? He proposed that each country set up a relief organization that could prepare in time of peace so that it would be ready to provide assistance in times of armed conflict. These would become the Red Cross societies. He also promoted the idea that parallel to that, an international convention be established among nations that would protect these relief organizations and medical personnel from being attacked by the belligerents, and specify that wounded soldiers receive medical attention, whichever side they belong to. His advocacy among state dignitaries was successful, and in 1864 already, the first Geneva Convention was indeed signed by 12 countries. This convention was the first milestone in the development of what is today known as international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict. By the early 20th century, virtually all sovereign states, including from other continents, had ratified the convention. By setting up national societies around the globe, the Red Cross became a household name for humanitarian action, comfort, and solidarity in the midst of war. In the meantime, the International Committee of the Red Cross, operating out of Geneva, was the driving force in coordinating international humanitarian action in wartime, and in promoting the implementation as well as the further development of humanitarian law. The novelty of Henri Dunant's legacy was this dual approach: alleviate suffering through direct action on the ground, le geste humanitaire, and at the same time codify rules in international treaty law that limit the methods and means of warfare to be applied by belligerents. The scope of the First Geneva Convention was limited to the protection of wounded combatants and medical personnel. But many lawmakers, politicians, and reasonable military leaders realized that other issues, like the treatment of prisoners of war, the protection of civilians not participating in the hostilities, and indeed the means and methods of warfare as such, needed to be discussed among nations so that common standards could be agreed upon. However, to get the powers of the time involved in such debate and to agree on minimal standards has proven to be an uphill struggle all along. It needed new terrible events on the battlefield to mobilize world public opinion and national lawmakers, who in turn pressurized their governments to negotiate further limitations to the destructive force of war with potentially hostile powers. Thus, it was only after countless men had succumbed to chemical weapon attacks in the trenches of northern France and died in captivity as prisoners of war in the First World War that a protocol was signed in 1925 to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, and the new Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war was agreed a few years later. As for the protection of civilians, detailed proposals had been submitted by the ICRC in the 1930s. But during the heightening tensions leading up to the Second World War, the powers of the time had no inclination at all to even discuss these ideas. So again, it was only as a result of the appalling destruction of the Second World War and the ugly face of genocide and extermination policies that a diplomatic and legal breakthrough came possible in the late 1940s. The adoption of the 4 Geneva Conventions on 12th of August 1949 resulted in a broad array of specific provisions to protect civilians in times of war, and more particularly in occupied territories. At the same time, the signatory states committed themselves for the first time to also applying some minimal rules of humanitarian law in internal armed conflicts. The suffering brought about by a new wave of local conflicts related to decolonization and the standoff between the superpowers was closely followed by hundreds of millions thanks to the newly developed global mass media. In particular, the daily televised images of the Vietnam War and the civil war in Biafra had an enormous impact on world public opinion. Despite sharp ideological differences between the Western world and the socialist countries, it was possible to strengthen the protection of populations affected by war and to enshrine their right to receive humanitarian assistance in a legally binding protocol in 1977. Today, the 8 years of an open-ended, asymmetric struggle, which started after the horrendous 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, have again highlighted the relevance of the existing law, such as the basic distinction between combatants and civilians, or the absolute prohibition of any form of torture. But they are also pushing us to clarify and develop humanitarian law even further. Now, my intention here is not to go through all the conventions and the customary law which has been developed during the past century and a half. I simply want to point out that, yes, today we do have an impressive body of law which strikes a delicate balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations. Tragically, the development of this law has not proceeded, but only followed the history of human destruction through war. However, agreeing upon a set of specific rules to observe in war does not in itself, obviously, protect all those who are affected by the destructive forces unleashed in armed conflict. Indeed, as I had to witness myself, there is often a huge gap between what happens in the heat of the battle and what the law prescribes. Realizing that the law is only effective to the extent it is being known and applied by combatants, the ICRC has set out to engage in a sustained dialogue with all possible armed forces and groups, be they the mighty military forces of the US or NATO, or non-state armed groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the myriad of armed factions in Darfur, Somalia, and many other places. The primary objective of this vast undertaking, in which hundreds of ICRC delegates over several decades by now have been involved, is to make sure that commanders integrate the basic provisions of the law of armed conflict in the standing orders and military exercises as a matter of course and of self-interest. As you can imagine, this effort has developed into a vast intercultural communication enterprise, since it implies that we argue our case not only on the basis of Western concepts of law, but engage proactively with scholars of Islamist thinking, for example, in order to broaden the historic and normative base of our effort. Such discussions have been quite productive, as they have made us acknowledge, for instance, that basic norms of humanitarian law, such as respect for prisoners or for women and children, were actually laid down more than a millennium ago by international Sharia law, centuries before they started to be formulated and codified by Hugo Grotius and his disciples. A second objective of this sustained and worldwide effort of dialogue and relationship building with the military and non-state armed groups is, of course, the necessity to make the ICRC known to them and to engage in an operational dialogue ahead of the moment when we need their approval and support to gain access to the civilian population caught up in war, to hospitals in need of supply, and to detainees. The dual approach of direct and normative action to limit the effects of war, which Henri Dunant outlined 150 years ago, is thus still at the very heart of the ICRC's mission statement and overall operational philosophy. We are convinced that we can only make a credible and effective contribution towards preserving human life and dignity in times of war if we are ready to assist the people exposed right there in the field where they are. It is not good enough to do advocacy work out of our offices in Geneva. We decided to be there in Gaza during the fighting in the early days of this year, to be there in the Vanni in northeastern Sri Lanka when the long-standing conflict between the Sri Lankan armed forces and the LTTE came to a tragic and violent close, or when hundreds of thousands had to flee the Swat Valley and other areas in northwestern Pakistan, which had become the battleground of the government of Pakistan and the Taliban. It is in these places where we struggle now in 2009, as Dunant has done 150 years ago, for the wounded to be evacuated in time and to receive appropriate medical treatment. It is there on the ground that we learn about people arrested or missing, and that we start to search for them, to visit them in places of detention in order to make sure they're treated humanely and can reconnect with their families. It is there that we can get in touch with civilian populations that have been put under pressure by the fighting or by armed groups threatening them, or have had to leave their homes and livelihoods behind in order to preserve their very lives. You can imagine what this implies in organizational and management terms, in particular with regard to the security of our own people. We have in fact grown to become a globally active organization with 12,000 staff, more than 200 field offices, and a 1 billion plus budget. Still, the ICRC has remained highly reactive and coherent. What keeps us all together and on our toes is our shared ambition to respond effectively and timely to the specific needs we identify in all trouble spots around the globe, together with the people affected. Direct access to all those affected by conflict is therefore our first and foremost operational imperative. This is why we will continue to sit down and drink tea with the Taliban in Afghanistan, as much as we will discuss with government officials and officers of the multinational forces in Kabul. Thank you very much for your